is we have such a situation that the military component is really the most important component of our identity. The enemy has traditionally, from time immemorial, tried to fight against us on our territory. It's a tragedy, unfortunately.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Force, and I'm your host, Myroslava Yaremki. The heroic Cossack age is the age of courage and endurance, the struggles for one's own identity and freedom. Nowadays, the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine are doing everything possible and impossible so that Ukrainians can live in a peaceful, calm, and free country. The military personnel focus on the following points: motivation, camaraderie, leadership, and identity. They contain the key to the effective work of any unit, as well as the Cossack factor, an element of a centuries-old tradition that existed and improved among Ukrainians. After all, Ukrainians, descendants of Cossacks, mentally and through common historical memory feel Cossack values. Therefore, knowledge of how the Cossacks lived and fought helps us not only to feel a connection with previous generations, but to use their experience and increase the effectiveness of the work of a modern combat unit. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the enduring Cossack legacy, exploring how, despite being shrouded in myth, it remains a fundamental pillar of shaping the strengths of the armed forces of Ukraine. If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. The Cossack tradition is still preserved in the armed forces of Ukraine, when each brigade has its own flag with certain symbols and slogans. In the Zaporizhia Cossack army, flags were called battle banners, and each regiment had them. Some brigades of the modern armed forces have names that are related to the Cossacks. 92nd Separate Assault Brigade named after the chieftain Ivan Sirko, 58th Separate Brigade named after Hetman Ivan Vyhovsky, and 57th Separate Brigade named after the chieftain Kostya Gordienko. Military historian and head of the NGO Military History Center Vasyl Pavlov believes that the Ukrainian army contributed to the development of Ukrainian culture since Cossack times. Let's hear what he has to say.
We have to clearly distinguish between fictional motivational history and true motivational history. So, I would discard fictional history for now, because the enemy has been conducting extremely powerful psyops based on some informational historical patterns that are formed by false historical myths. And they encourage society to act according to certain patterns. For example, one of the most common myths is that Ukrainian Cossacks are exclusively peasants, and the peasants have always opposed the nobles and gentry. Therefore, Ukrainian peasants, Ukrainian citizens, must overthrow the Ukrainian gentry and once again fraternize with our ancient enemy. If we take a real historical background, we have to understand that population strata differ in their social level and their attitude to the state or to the situation. But we should focus on what unites us and gives us hope for the future. It is a constructive rather than destructive element. You have mentioned the Ukrainian siege riflemen whose song Red Viburnum became a symbol of resistance. If we start using them as a tool, we will see that in addition to a military component, there is an equally important cultural component. The Ukrainian army contributed to the development of Ukrainian culture. The same is true with the armed forces of Ukraine. The armed forces of Ukraine preserve the Ukrainian military tradition and power, as well as promote Ukrainian culture in all its manifestations. Our ancestors clearly understood that there is an army that protects the state and territory, and there is a population that, relying on this army, has the opportunity to create an economy and develop culture. As soon as the economic basis is created, the ideology of independence appears. As for the modern armed forces of Ukraine, they manifest themselves in all areas of social life. Our servicemen become civil activists and civil servants. There are also athletes, singers, and artists in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, we have such a situation that the military component is really the most important component of our identity, because fate decreed that in order for us to be who we are, to be ourselves, we always had to defend ourselves and to prove it on the battlefield.
In order to strengthen the feeling of motivation in the war, it is enough to understand that this war is not just a product of time, but a trend in Russian-Ukrainian relations. Because the Ukrainian military democratic community has always been a challenge for the Russian imperial centralist community. Professor of the Department of World History of Modern Times of the Ukrainian Catholic University, Vadym Zadunaiskyy, will draw parallels between Russian hybrid warfare during the Cossack era and its contemporary strategies now.
The enemy marched through the regions that were closest and made those border regions dependent on them. In fact, the northern part of the Hetmanate. It was another tragic page of our history when, after the Andrusiv armistice, there was further division into right and left bank Ukraine, which pinpointed the regions where the torn Ukrainian Cossack state was more influenced and where there were more threats for the local elite, the crushed Ukrainian Cossacks, with whom they preferred to cooperate. It became obvious during the military operations of late 1658, early 1659. It was a prototype of what was to come. It became clear that part of the Cossack elite had to cooperate with the enemy, both because of personal disagreements, troubles, personal claims to strengthen their role in deciding the prospects for the development of Cossack statehood, and because of threats from the Moscow army. And by the way, the involvement of Cossack regiments under the flags of the Moscow army was also a tragedy that actually showed the beginning of the internal civil war. It had already begun when Pushkar and Barbash stood up against Vyhovsky, and then it gained more strength due to the involvement of an external factor, the Moscow army. Previously, there were disagreements only among the Cossacks themselves, but then an external factor used the disaffected and took them under their banners. But I mean that obviously those were Ukrainian Cossacks who stood on Vyhovsky's side before the Battle of Konotop. I'd like to emphasize that there were attempts to intercept, there were even attempts to correspond. Zadunaiskyy wrote letters and tried to explain, even remind emotionally, that they had eaten Cossack bread together, gained Cossack glory together. Who are you against? On behalf of Vyhovsky, we guarantee you'll be forgiven. Do not raise arms against your Cossack mother. Do not raise arms against Ukraine, by and large. The enemy used it. They used it to cover up their aggression, their intervention, exactly like in 2014, when hybrid Russian troops formally used some rallies, but in fact, the main potential for armed invasion, aggression on the territory of Ukraine was carried out by Russian little green men in Crimea, by pseudo-Cossack formation that arrived from the Russian Federation in Crimea, in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, and where there were few local collaborators. But the enemy still took them under their flag, but used its own troops. It was the same in all those battles, military clashes conducted by Zadunaiskyy, Vyhovsky, and Mehmed IV on the side of Vyhovsky. The main adversary was the Moscow army, and for, let's say, some reflection that allegedly used Cossacks and fought in the interests of the Cossacks, they involved the Cossacks of Bespali and Tsutura. The same happened in the battles near Chudnov a little later. Not only can the Konotop battle be cited as an example. A year later, there was a battle of Chudnov and the Slobodishin treaties as a result. When Yuri Khmelnytsky was first forced to lower his head and submit to the Moscow authorities, and then finding himself in a different geopolitical and military strategic situation, he, with the support of the opponents of Muscovy, was able to change his geopolitical orientation and was supported by part of the Cossacks. And the Muscovites used those who did not support them. This is a traditional way: divide and conquer. In military terms, it is a very successful way. They fought on our land, including partly with our people. And it was a double blow. Our economy and infrastructure were destroyed. It was then and it is now. According to an outstanding strategist, Sun Tzu, one cartload of the enemy's provisions is equivalent to 20 of one's own. That is, it's his measure. We see that the economy collapses both during the ruin and during Russian aggression, especially during large-scale aggression. The enemy has traditionally, from time immemorial, tried to fight against us on our territory. It's our tragedy, unfortunately.
You've been watching a special project of Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!